Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, more MPs call for a ceasefire as the Israel-Hamas war reverberates on Parliament Hill. Our journalist panel breaks it down.
Canada remains firm and steadfast in our commitment to a two-state solution.
Canada still committed to a two-state solution as Gaza waits for essential supplies. We get the latest analysis from a former ambassador to Israel. And the U.S. president is linking Middle East violence to the war in Ukraine. A former top American diplomat tells us why it matters. This is PrimeTime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson, in for Michael Serapio. 33 MPs have signed an open letter to the Prime Minister. They want an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. More than 20 of those MPs are Liberal, and Justin Trudeau is facing questions today about a possible caucus divide over the Canadian response.
Canadians of all backgrounds who are represented in Parliament are reflecting the very real fears and concerns that everyone has. So yeah, there are lots of different perspectives, but there are shared fears and concerns amongst all parliamentarians, and a commitment every single day to keep everyone safe here in Canada and everywhere around the world.
Let's welcome our Friday journalist panel now. Alex Ballingall of the Toronto Star, Nick Taylor-Vaisey of Politico, and Kristy Kirkup of the Globe and Mail. Kristy, we start with the Prime Minister. We just heard him referring to what your paper and others have been reporting, that there is dissent within the Liberal caucus over how the government is handling the Israel-Hamas war. And now we do have this letter with 33 MPs, including Liberals, New Democrats, and Greens, all calling for a ceasefire, explicitly saying that needs to be Canadian policy. What do you make of how the situation in the Middle East is reverberating on Parliament Hill right now?
Well, I think we see that the Prime Minister is, we saw him come out in the House of Commons and make some comments earlier this week where I think he was trying to be very careful in his language. He talked about Israel's right to defend itself. He also called Hamas a terrorist organization. But then at the end of his comments, he talked about the fact that international law and humanitarian law apply everywhere, including in Gaza. And he talked about essentially that Palestinian people are seeking a better future for themselves. So I think he was very careful in that language. Clearly behind the scenes, again, he was getting pressure, and again, the Globe reported as much. There was a meeting that was held and some strong views that were shared. And then I think this letter is just another step further to underscore the pressure that the Prime Minister is facing, that Canada is facing in terms of how it is handling the situation in the Middle East.
And Nick, there has been some political consensus. We saw the party leaders speaking at a conference on anti-Semitism early this week, but we do have the situation where we do have some MPs calling for a ceasefire. Conservatives are obviously not calling for a ceasefire, and the government not calling for a ceasefire yet. What's your take here?
Well, it was a remarkable show of unity that first day, October 7th, 8th, and then into the 9th, into the start of that first week after the weekend attack. And it was perhaps not unprecedented, but it was certainly notable. But then the conversation, both in Canada and internationally, starts to turn to all of the people involved in this region, and naturally gets to that point. And at a certain point, if you're a Liberal MP, if you're a New Democratic MP, you're going to want to voice what you really feel, or what your constituents are telling you, or what your colleagues in caucus are telling you. Maybe they're persuading you, giving you a perspective you hadn't had on an issue that, of course, people have thought about for years and years and years, decades, generations. So it was going to become complicated. And I think that was the remarkable thing about the first few days, was that it seemed like in the political conversation, it at first was not complicated, at least as far as the basics of what Canadian politicians and the Canadian Parliament felt about this.
Alex, what do you think? Because we did, again, see some unusual scenes earlier this week where you had Liberal MPs on camera essentially going against the government, calling for a ceasefire. The Prime Minister today is saying that the disagreements we're seeing on Parliament Hill are indicative of Canada as a whole, that this is a very divisive issue, and he says that, that remains a strength of Canada, that people are voicing these different opinions. What do you think of what the Prime Minister is saying here about the fact that it can be a positive that we are seeing these various views coming out, bubbling up on the surface here in Ottawa?
Can it be a positive? I mean, I think it's just evidence of, and we've heard this from MPs this week, like you said, that this conflict, for some people, it has such a personal, almost visceral resonance. One of my colleagues did an interview with the Mental Health and Addictions Minister where she didn't want to get into it, but she mentioned that her family had been personally impacted by the attacks in Israel. We've heard from some Muslim MPs talking about how, I can't remember who it was, but the other day talking about how his sister was taking his niece to school and was getting harassed on the street as a visibly Muslim woman. So I think for a lot of MPs, and we're kind of seeing it reflected in some of the things they've said publicly, in some of the divisions behind closed doors, and now in this letter, that there's a real emotional, personal resonance here.
Okay, I want to turn to another issue that's brewing this week. That is the potential Alberta pension plan and the political battle over that. Nick, we saw Justin Trudeau and Danielle Smith trading open letters talking about this pension plan. Then we have Pierre Poilievre adding his voice to the mix, saying that while he doesn't think it would be a good idea for Alberta to leave the CPP, he's essentially blaming the PM for attacking Alberta and starting all this. What do you make of kind of how we have this triangle now of the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, and the Premier of Alberta all talking at each other?
Right. Well, there was chatter online when Trudeau sent his open letter that he was trying to wedge Pierre Poilievre, and it was this kind of 3D chess. I'm going to take on the Alberta Premier, but really, my true goal is to make the Conservative leader in Ottawa uncomfortable. And if that was his goal, it maybe backfired, maybe it didn't. I mean, this is a developing issue, and I think a lot of people are trying to just figure out where they stand on something as complex as the Canada Pension Plan and Alberta removing itself from the Canada Pension Plan. And it's a complex public policy issue. But I think it was also a bit of, if you ask reporters in Ottawa, what's Pierre Poilievre going to say about this? You probably flip a coin and 50-50 what he's going to believe. And so he took the tack that I will be captain in Canada. If you make me Prime Minister, Alberta, I would prefer that you stay in this national system, and you should be comfortable in that, because if I'm in charge, everything will be fine. We'll have federalism, peace. He's not the first to promise that as an aspiring Prime Minister, but that was his overall message.
Okay, and Kristy, what do you think about this bit of federalism then? Because we know the Alberta government and the Trudeau government are already at odds, especially over energy. How do you see this aligning with some of those conversations?
I think that's a good question. I think, frankly, the Prime Minister, even in the framing of his letter, when he was going at Danielle Smith, very, very directly, right? And it was an open letter, by the way, that was, obviously it was an open letter and shared with a lot of people, but the Premier herself actually said, essentially that it was shared with other people before it was even shared with her. And he was, I think, yes, going at this issue of Alberta potentially removing itself from CPP, but also I think trying to get into a public discussion with Danielle Smith and kind of underline the differences between his policies and where Alberta is going, and the Premier shooting back and saying, that there essentially could be legal and constitutional consequences for this. So it's quite the battle that has been staged. I don't know what twist comes next, but certainly the Premier is saying, get ready for a fight, because we're going to launch one against this.
So, Alex, I want to get you to weigh in this, because you're writing for the Toronto Star, and it's interesting that sometimes these issues are specific to just what's going on in Alberta. But here you have Premier Danielle Smith taking out ads across Canada, telling non-Albertans that, no, your pensions aren't at risk if we go ahead with this provincial pension plan. Justin Trudeau saying the exact opposite. So we have the situation where, this is an issue between Alberta and the federal government, but it is actually an issue for millions of voters who have pensions right across Canada.
You could argue that a lot of the fights that we've seen between Alberta and the federal government in recent years over the Impact Assessment Act, over the carbon tax, over the clean fuel standards, over whatever, are similar to that. That, okay, Alberta has their specific Alberta objections. We've got the oil sands. They have their own agenda. But it has a huge resonance on climate policy, in this case on pension policy. So I think from the Toronto Star's perspective, it's an important national issue, even though it's such an Alberta thing as well. I think it does have a more cascading effect for sure.
Okay, we have a couple moments left. I want to talk about another P word, that's pharmacare. And Alex, I know you've been following this story in the wake of the NDP convention, where delegates last weekend said, look, it's a universal bill or bust when it comes to the Liberal NDP confidence agreement. Now, is that the case, though, for Jagmeet Singh? Is that going to be a red line for him in terms of what goes forward with this agreement?
So he doesn't make it really easy to pin that down, and I think he doesn't want to be pinned down on it. We saw him wriggling out of that, I think it was yesterday at his press conference or the day before. Yeah, I mean, what is the red line real? His health critic says absolutely. I think in speaking to the Liberal side, they also take it seriously, but they're hoping to try and talk a way through this. I think that there's been no sign that the Liberals are willing to go as far as the NDP wants, but I think both sides want the deal to survive. So there's this bit of a weird situation going on right now, and it's still not clear where it'll land, I think.
Okay, Nick, weigh in on this. How do you see this seeming logjam resolving? Or maybe it won't.
Well, maybe it won't. And there's the political conversation, and then there's the policy conversation. And the Globe and Mail was reporting this week about whether or not Canada is actually equipped to implement a universal national pharmacare program if the politicians turn it into law. And then you also have the purse strings conversation. This is a lot of P's. The Parliamentary Budget Office put out a report.
It's okay.
PBO put out a report saying that this kind of program would cost billions and billions of dollars, which of course doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it is a question worth asking. And so how that has an impact on the political conversations and how far the Liberals are willing to go, it'll be a conversation for, well, I guess this fall, but certainly into 2024.
And Kristy, I'll give you the last word on this. Speaking of fall, we're expecting a fall fiscal update soon from the government. And as Nick mentioned, there is the fiscal aspect of this along with the political negotiations. What are you going to be looking at?
You know, I think that Mark Holland, the health minister, has already kind of indicated that the rub here is going to be about whether Canada is actually in a financial position at this very moment to move ahead on pharmacare. However, going back to like what is stipulated in the actual working agreement between the NDP and the Liberals, it does talk about work towards a universal pharmacare program, and it also talks about legislation, a Canada Pharmacare Act, being passed by the end of 2023. So let's say, theoretically, you know, Mark Holland's saying there's conversations towards a bill. There's no bill yet. Time is ticking. If they're actually going to put forward at least legislation to try and take a step toward getting it done, then I think the NDP is very keen to see that bill be put forward right away. And again, if Mark Holland is saying conversations are happening about a bill, perhaps that indicates that, you know, this is going to take more time than certainly the NDP would like. All right, Kristy Kirkup, Alex Ballingall, Nick Taylor-Vaisey, thank you all.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister says Canada remains committed to an Israeli state and a Palestinian state on day 14 of the Israel-Hamas war.
But Canada remains firm and steadfast in our commitment to a two-state solution. The world and the region needs a peaceful, safe, prosperous, viable Palestinian state alongside a peaceful, prosperous, democratic, safe Israeli state, Israel. This is something that we have always called for. It is something we will continue to work for every day as we move forward.
Jon Allen is a former Canadian ambassador to Israel, now with the Munk School of Global Affairs. Mr. Allen, welcome. Now, we just heard the Prime Minister say Canada is going to be firm and steadfast when it comes to a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians, but there are less specifics on Canada's policy for the future of Gaza. What's your sense of what we're hearing from the Canadian government?
Well, I'm very glad to hear that the Prime Minister is reiterating Canadian policy. It's been policy for many years, and in my view, obviously, this is not the time to be pushing it right now. But once the dust settles and once the pain on both sides begins to subside, and it will take time, and once we can get proper leadership into both Israel, getting rid of Bibi Netanyahu and having Mahmoud Abbas move on and getting some young, dynamic leadership in the Palestinian Authority, then I think we have to really begin to provide a horizon for peace and to look towards different things that each side has to do. And I would start with stopping any settlement expansion and getting rid of illegal settlements on the Israeli side. And I would, moving towards elections, legitimate elections in the PA, in the West Bank. On Gaza, we're going to have to see what happens. Ground invasion likely, an attempt to eliminate the political and the military leaders of Hamas, difficult. And then there's going to have to be some interim solution for Gaza. The PA can't go in there. They won't have credibility. I think we're going to need a combination of states to go in, perhaps, and try and manage Gaza as an interim authority with the UN playing a role there.
Okay, you're talking about some long-term solutions clearly here. I do want to ask you about some of the short-term Canadian diplomacy that's happening and the fact that Canada has yet to publicly line up behind Israel and the United States on their intelligence about this week's hospital bombing in Gaza. What do you think about how the Prime Minister and the government is handling this question?
Well, I'm only imagining that the Prime Minister hasn't seen the intelligence. It's very closely held. The intelligence authorities don't want to give away too much. In other words, they don't want to give away their sources and their methods of collection, etc. So I would imagine, in a way, unfortunately, it's in the hands of the Americans and the Israelis only. It would be better if it could be shared with the international community. So if it's true that it was not Israel, and that it was truly an accident, I think that would go some way to trying to calm the Arab street, which is really riled up now. It's not going to solve problems, but if it was really demonstrated beyond a doubt that this was an accident, i.e. Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired, and it wasn't Israel, then that would take at least some of the pressure off.
Okay, and as we're talking, there is uncertainty about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and just when supplies are actually going to cross. We're seeing the UN Secretary General at the Rafah crossing with Egypt today. He's saying that the trucks that are lined up there need to get moving as soon as possible. What needs to happen right away on the humanitarian front?
Well, I think the Canadian government and the Americans and anybody else that can should be putting pressure on Israel to say enough is enough. Imposing a siege on Gaza, I don't think was a good idea. It was a horrible idea for the Palestinians, innocent civilians, mothers, babies, terrible for the hospitals. But it's a bad idea for Israel because it demonstrates that they're not showing the appropriate sympathy. We understand they have to defend themselves. We understand they feel a need to go in, but there's no need for innocent Palestinians to be starving, to be without water, to be without medicine. If they don't want to send fuel in because they think it's dual use, well, maybe, although hospitals do need fuel. But water, food, medicines, it seems to me there is no reason not to send that in. I know there have been allegations that Hamas has taken the goods, but the Red Cross has said they're ready to receive them. And if you could throw in a ton of it, not just the first 20 trucks, but many, many more trucks which are needed, Hamas isn't going to grab it all, if any.
Okay, we have a moment left, and I do want to stay with Hamas with you for my last question, which is about hostages. And Hamas reportedly saying that 2 of its 200 hostages are going to be released for humanitarian reasons, an American mother and daughter. Do you see any wider significance in that decision by Hamas?
Well, I mean, 2 out of some 200 Americans trying to appeal to America to, encourage Israel to start negotiating. Hamas should be releasing all of the children, all of the women, and all of the older people. If they want to hold soldiers, they can hold them. But they're not doing their own image any good by holding and putting the lives of hostages in danger. And these people deserve to be released. They've gone through hell, and Hamas should realize it's in their own interests to release them.
All right, Ambassador Jon Allen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
The U.S. president wants Congress to okay more than $100 billion in new spending. That includes more support for Israel and for Ukraine.
We cannot and will not let terrorists like Hamas and tyrants like Putin win. I refuse to let that happen. In moments like these, we have to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. The United States of America. And there is nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together.
Let's bring in Gordon Giffin, who was American ambassador to Canada during the Clinton administration. Ambassador Giffin, good to see you. And I want to start with the president's speech itself. He says we're at an inflection point. That was actually the first point he made. What do you make of Joe Biden's message connecting the Middle East to the war in Ukraine?
I thought his message last night was inspirational. The compelling part of the way he delivered a very profound lesson and message to the American public was he spoke with personal conviction. I've seen an awful lot of political leaders make statements and speeches over the years, but you could tell the intensity with which President Biden feels this in his bones. And so he wasn't just reading a speech, he was delivering a sermon.
Okay, now as part of that, we did hear the president say he wants $105 billion, not just for Israel, not just for Ukraine, but also for border security and also measures that counter China. Now, of course, that request is coming without any speaker as we talk today. So what are the chances that this package is actually going to get passed in any kind of timely fashion?
I think it'll get passed in a fashion and a time frame that's sufficient to be effective. I think, and listen, what do I know? The House of Representatives has demonstrated that they could be historically inept and disorganized, but I trust and hope that they will get that straightened out pretty quickly. Some of the aid that's needed, particularly for Israel and in some measure for Ukraine, can be sent without further congressional action. But to get to the levels that he's described in this message to Congress now, there's no doubt it takes congressional action. The Senate will pass it, I think, with some deliberate speed. And I do think that by sometime next week, we'll be in a position to get the House to pass it. Importantly, it's got border security and China related aspects to it to address some of the conservatives in the House to try and get enough in there that would interest them that they will proceed to vote for this. Because, as you know, there's been some reticence expressed by some in the House of Representatives to further fund Ukraine.
Right, and there is, as you say, that resistance to more aid for Ukraine. And there's also been opposition, not just on Capitol Hill, but elsewhere, about President Biden's strong support for Israel. Let's go back to the speech. How well do you think he made his case to Americans to try and bridge some of these divisions?
Well, I think he made the case in a very compelling way. How many people, one, were watching and two, are open-minded is another question. But I think he did as good a job as you could humanly do. And as I say, having watched an awful lot of big speeches by major leaders in the United States, this goes up very near the top of speeches that I have seen. So I think it made a difference. I think his speech right after the attack in southern Israel made a difference. I think his trip to Israel made a difference. He is showing tremendous political courage and leadership on the world stage, and doing the kinds of things that at least I would hope the United States would do to lead the free world.
Now, the president, throughout the week, not just last night, he was in Israel earlier, as you say, continuing to urge the Israeli government to learn from the American 9/11 experience, not to be, in his words, blinded by rage. Should he be more forceful about the death toll in Gaza and the humanitarian situation there?
Well, I guess I'll leave that judgment of balance to him. He's in the seat. He's the one that has the information. He is clearly trying to balance our unequivocal support for Israel and our unequivocal rejection of the kind of terror and atrocities committed by the Hamas terrorists with the maintaining the potential for some political resolution in the long run of the stress in that region. And as you know, he was bringing the potential of a Saudi Arabia-Israel deal to the table. No one else has done that. And I think part of the reason we saw this series of atrocities was the fear of some of these radical groups in the Middle East that Biden was actually going to create the kind of coalition that could give us peace for a long time.
Okay, we have just a moment left, and I want to pick your diplomatic brain about Canada before you leave. Of course, the U.S. is lining up behind Israel on the evidence about this week's hospital bombing in Gaza. Canada has not yet done so publicly. The Prime Minister says he wants to be careful before reaching a conclusion. What's your reaction to how Canada has been responding this week and throughout this crisis?
Well, I agree with the proposition of being careful, but events are transpiring pretty quickly, and you don't have a luxury of thinking about it for too long. Presumably, he's getting the benefit of Canadian intelligence, and the Canadian intelligence services are among the top in the world. So the desire to get that information makes sense to me. It's reasonable. But I do think, in the case of the United States at least, our intelligence services are pretty confident. It's clear from what the president had to say. And I think we have been decisive in the face of rapidly changing events. And if the bad guys don't see resolution in our approach, I fear it invites further tragedy.
Ambassador Gordon Giffin, really appreciate your thoughts on all this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our show for Friday. For everyone here at CPAC, I'm Andrew Thompson. Thanks for watching Primetime Politics. Good night.